So it's a pleasure for us to be able to welcome James Myoun Ford Roshi. James is thank you, up from Southern California. Really lucky to have him here this weekend. We've been doing a retreat this weekend, looking at some of the expressions that Zen has taken on in the West, how it's come from the East and appeared in the West in different ways and in different places. So it's been a really, it's been a really good weekend. Really learned a lot, and Roshi lives as a Unitarian Universalist minister, and also as a Zen teacher, as a Zen master. He He's been making his rounds a little bit. His new book is called The Intimate Way of Zen. Right here, beautiful cover. Effort, Surrender, and Awakening on the Spiritual Journey.
So, many years ago, I was first exploring the spiritual life and what that might mean. And I stumbled on a book, and it was called Journeys on the Razor's Edge, and it was by somebody named Simon's Roof. And I spent some time in recent years trying to track him down, and it's not really clear. This is his book. There's nothing else. He may have been a theosophist, not sure. Possibly he was in the Alice Bailey work, not sure. But what I do know is that in the first part of the 20th century, he went to India, and he wandered around, and he met Ramana Maharshi. He met all sorts of interesting and powerful figures of Indian spirituality in that first half of the 20th century. Out of that, he spent a little time collecting stories. And Journeys on the Razor's Edge is an anthology of Indian spiritual stories, mostly. Often little bare bones kinds of things. There was one story that kind of really caught my imagination many years ago, and has never quite left who I am. And I have thought about it and reflected upon it, and then somewhere, maybe a decade ago, I started writing down my version of the story. And then I would continue playing with it and working on it and revisiting it and setting it aside for quite a long time. Then at some point it came time for me to write this book here, The Intimate Way of Zen, which is my attempt at a distillation of the arc of a spiritual life. What does it look like over time? Not my first effort. This is my sixth book. The good people at Shambhala chose to do it. And as I did this book, what I did was I hooked it to the 10 ox herding pictures, which some of us here may know, a map of the path of awakening from the Zen tradition. I've always admired it, and I've thought about it a lot, and I've reflected on it and given talks and heard talks. And what I thought it could be enriched with is something. It's a pretty straightforward narrative of awakening itself, but it turns out there are all sorts of other things going on in that journey. Dark nights of the soul, dark tea times of the soul, dead ends, and interesting bypaths. And I kind of filled it out as I've encountered it in my life, and that was the book. And I came to, well, how do I end this thing? Where does it go? What is the summation for us? And I realized independently I'd been working on that for a decade, and actually for 50 years from when I first read the book. And so I took it, I washed it through again one last time of the many times in my exploring what this arc, what this mystery of the spiritual life might be. And the nice thing for you all is that you read this, you don't have to buy the book. You've got the nub of it. So I started this chapter, and this is pretty much just it, straightforward. There's an old saying about politics. You run for office with poetry, but you must govern with prose. As the spiritual way opens for us, we discover our lives must incorporate both prose and poetry. There are the ordinary tasks of life, work, relationships, maybe romantic partnerships, or marriage. Sometimes children. There is the ticking of the clock. It certainly feels like prose. But as we open our eyes and hearts, we discover something. Actually, it's all poetry. Even the proof of our lives is poetry. In fact, it turns out the universe is writing stories and songs, actually whole symphonies. And there we are, you and me. We, in fact, live and breathe and take our being in stories. Like the turtles in that old joke, it's stories all the way down. And so, to recap the song and prose and poetry, to bring it all together, once upon a time, long ago and far away, there was a burglar. She was quick-witted and nimble-footed, so she was successful in her chosen trade. However, as sometimes happens when one is good at something, she kept pushing the envelope, and with that came the disaster. She was discovered trying to break into a rich merchant's home. She fled without anyone catching a glimpse of her face. However, as a great cry of "Thief!" rang out, pretty much the whole village was soon in hot pursuit. Fortunately for her, she was just far enough ahead of the crowd that when she saw a cave opening between the road and a creek, she had time to throw herself into the water, roll in the mud, and then climb back up to the cave. There she sat, settling into a traditional meditation posture in front of the cave opening. It looked exactly as if she were simply one more of the many mendicants, monastics, mad people, and others who took to the road on the great spiritual quest. When the crowd arrived in front of the cave and the convincing-looking monastic, their leader saw her and said, "Oh, Holy One, did you see the thief we were chasing?" The burglar simply ignored the question and continued sitting as if she were meditating. One of the villagers said to their leader, "Can't you see she's meditating? We would earn some very bad karma if we disturb her." And another said, "Let's wait. When she's ready, she'll speak." There was a muttering of agreement, and the leader understood one leads by ordering people to do what they want to do. So they all sat on the ground in front of the thief and waited. While the burglar sat there pretending to meditate, she desperately wondered when they would move on. Instead, more and more villagers gathered. Some remained standing. Most sat down. A few even began to meditate themselves. She had this terrible feeling, as if she were trapped in the bottom of a dry well. After about 2 hours, vastly longer than the burglar ever thought she could hold still, she pretended to awaken from her meditative trance. Slowly opening her eyes, she looked out at what was now about 50 people, all of them quietly waiting. She cleared her throat and spoke softly, but with enough volume to be heard by everyone there. "Why are you looking for some poor thief, dear ones? Wouldn't it be vastly better to search for your true nature? After all, who isn't stealing their lives by ignoring the great questions of life and death?" With this, the villagers were overcome. Some with grief at their wasted lives, others at the call to something more important than perhaps they had ever considered before. A few ran back to the village to gather flowers to give her. Others went home and got some food as an offering, including rare treats. Presented with the flowers and food, the burglar ate, trying not to gobble or look greedy, then asking herself, what would a wise person do in a similar situation? She asked that the majority of the food be distributed among those present, specifying that the poorest get enough, and particularly some of the best delicacies. She also handed out the flowers to everyone. People felt graced. Finally, the rich merchant himself stepped forward and implored the wise nun that she remain there and grace their village with her wisdom. The burglar thought to herself, well, while I'm pretty good at my trade as a thief, it is hard work, and it is too dangerous. This holy nun gig could be an easy way to make a living. As a thief, she thought she could easily steal what she needed just by pretending to be holy. So she said, "I will stay with you, but only for a brief time." The villagers were ecstatic. They brought her blankets and candles, and someone even thought to bring her a down-filled pillow. Life was comfortable beyond what she had ever experienced. The price was that she had to pretend to meditate for hours every day, and then in the early evening to answer questions the villagers would bring her. Answering questions turned out not to be difficult. It seemed she knew what a good and generous heart would do, or as she thought of it, what a sucker might do. Not a lot of difference, she was pretty sure. Pretending to meditate, however, was harder. She knew people were watching, so she really had to hold still. Life paraded by on the road. Merchants, monastics, families, and children. Once an ox led by a boy with a rope held in a loop through its nose trotted by. The pair paused and looked at her. Their eyes, boy and ox, were dark pools, then moved on without saying anything. Time passed. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The food was good. The blankets were warm. And oh my, that pillow. But the burglar's meditating continued to be a terrible ordeal. She experimented with her posture, trying to find a position that wasn't painful. She began to sit on the pillow and gradually became comfortable sitting cross-legged. Over time, her knees began to drop and then touch the ground. But then there was her mind. She fantasized about everything that had happened in her life, how she was raised, the gift of learning to read at the local temple, the reading of books. There weren't many, but she read them over and over. Then there was her trade, figuring out how to steal without getting caught, experiencing what happened early on when she was caught, the moments of joy and the long times of boredom, and intermittent flashes of terror. She also fantasized about the future, about what new treats the villagers might bring, about what she would do when she tired of this and returned to the road and a life of burglaries. But as she passed in her imagination from the past to the future, increasingly she noticed something else. At first, it was like a flashing silence, just for a moment. Gradually, it grew larger in her consciousness. After a while, as those weeks passed into those months, that space, that quiet, that just being present became a large part of her holding still, pretending to meditate. Something was now different. She began seeing the villagers in a new light. And even the words that came out of her mouth now landed in her own ears in a new way. She gradually came to know the villagers, their sorrows, how they could be so petty and even sometimes cruel. The various intrigues in their lives, their loves as they arose and sometimes fell apart, other times deepened, their many generosities, sometimes unconscious, sometimes grand, and even costly. Gradually, she began to love them. And increasingly self-aware, she began to see how her own life was just like theirs. She knew they were different people, and yet somehow, mysteriously, they were all somehow one. Increasingly, as she spoke, everything she shared was based in that mystery, that they were different and that they were more closely connected than the finest woven fabric. Then the teenager appeared. He approached her one evening, made bows, and said he had been wandering looking for a teacher. And he had began to hear of this amazing nun who spoke wisely and, more importantly, modeled the great gift of silent meditation. He declared he wanted to learn her wisdom. Not knowing what to do, she simply ignored him. He took a place in the dirt below her as she began to pretend to meditate. He sat quietly. The next day, she told him to go. She wasn't interested in having disciples, but he continued to sit with her at a respectful distance. She knew she had to pretend to be generous, so she made sure he was fed. And before long, the villagers made sure he had blankets and even a pillow of his own. He seemed much less interested in that stuff than she was. What he seemed to love was to sit quietly. She asked him, "What are you doing while meditating?" He said he did what he was taught when he first decided to walk the spiritual path. He counted the breath, putting a 1 on his inhalation, then exhaled, put a 2 on the next inhalation, and continuing on until 10, after which he repeated the process. She said nothing. Then she tried it for herself and discovered it helped with her concentration, but it also tended to obscure that quiet place that seemed increasingly interesting to her. So a few days later, she told him that he might try just sitting quietly, not trying to think, not trying to not think. And he did. She began to wonder if it was time to escape. The problem was that there were villagers around pretty much all the time. And the boy, well, he was there all the time. So the burglar was stuck. Over time, the burglar grew quieter. She witnessed the day as it began. She witnessed the day as it passed. She witnessed the evening as it arose. Her last moment before sleep was noticing, witnessing, being present. And her words almost always came from that place. The place where she saw she and they were all the same. Increasingly, she talked about the silence, about what she found and what they might find. One day, the boy came to her and said that when he took a walk down by the creek, a crow called out. And in that moment, he realized the crow, the creek, the trees, he himself, and all things were joined so closely that the right word for that was what was true and present was simply one. He then added, embarrassed, how he knew even that one seemed a little bit too much. She wasn't sure what to say, so she simply smiled at him, put her hands together, and made a small bow. They continued together in this way as the months turned into years. She wasn't sure when it happened for herself. In fact, she never had that big thing like her disciple. What she did have was a gradual growing into peace and joy and gratitude for it all. In that parade of humanity, at some point another ox trotted by, this time without an attendant. The image of it swishing its tail as it trotted down the road stuck in her heart. Eventually, her fame as a wise counselor and teacher of the ways of the heart spread across the country. She was attended to faithfully by her disciple, who was increasingly seen as a wise teacher himself. A small community of monks and nuns gathered around her, and within the village, others seemed to become wise as well. One year, she fell ill, but that seemed okay. Her disciples tended to her, and that was okay. The villagers came to ask her last questions, and that was okay. The world, as terrible as it was also something wonderful, something amazing. And when she died, her senior disciple, now a wise and respected counselor, oversaw the burning of her corpse. He installed her ashes under some small rocks out beyond the small monastery of nuns and monks. The community elected him to succeed their founding teacher. Always, before he lectured on the mysteries of the way, he would thank the good gods that he had been given such a wonderful guide on the mysteries of life and death. The teacher who stole his delusions, and then, in doing so, opened his heart. Mystery piled upon mystery. The intimate